Warren will talk about some of the real scientific stuff, coupled with, I'm sure, some of his own research and liaison that he's had with other top researchers overseas. So his will be the very scientific stuff, and I'm backing off from that because I'm not a scientist and most of it's just like another language to me. So I'm going to talk about some of the more general aspects of the conference, and then Warren will take over and talk about his stuff. That's a bit blurred, I'm afraid, but that's where we had the conference. It was right by Big Ben. We won't get a picture like that again for a few years because I believe Big Ben is now covered in scaffolding and will be for 2 or 3 years while they completely redo it. But this building in the front here was where we were, and it was the most beautiful building with a wonderful painted ceiling, a fantastic venue. And the conference was for a mixture of people. There were some of the top researchers from all around the world, and we'd all had a 2-day meeting before the conference, what they call a colloquium, a sort of brainstorming session. And then the 1-day conference that I'm going to talk about was for GPs, those who have the illness, and carers, other hangers-on and so on. Quite a big audience, so it was very general. A lot of science was discussed. And it was opened by this man, Dr. Ian Charles, and I'm just mentioning this because in Britain they're in the throes of building a so-called centre of excellence where a lot of the research and clinical work for people with ME will be done. It's an enormous campus in Norwich in East Anglia, and they're going to be looking at a lot of the relationships between a word you'll hear a lot about in the next few years, if not already, the microbiome, the immune system and health generally. And they do a lot of food research there. It was originally a food research centre. But I mean, we are talking an absolutely enormous campus, probably take you all day to walk around it. Just to enlarge on that word microbiome, which you may not have heard about much, though you may have heard it mentioned. The microbiome is the sort of whole big lot of bacteria and other organisms that live throughout our gut. It's that sort of home, as it were, for all these bacteria, many of which are very, very important for our well-being. And the microbiota are the actual bugs themselves. So you'll hear those terms used from time to time, more and more, I think. And lots of important areas of research were covered at the conference and also have been covered, of course, on the internet, and Warren will be covering some of these things. But this illness now encompasses all these areas, if not many, many more. And I think, you know, all the research is coming together and all these areas are beginning to fit together as we understand more and more about them. And as I say, it's a whole, another language really, and I personally am beginning to, you know, understand what some of the words mean, but a lot of it is very, very scientific and way above my head anyway. But those are some of the big areas of research that are going on all around the world, and so many of these researchers now are linking up and working in coordination with each other, which is also very encouraging. I'm just picking out one or two of the, what I would call important things that were discussed at the conference, and this was fairly early on in the day, and Professor Staines is from Queensland, Australia, Griffith University, and he works with Professor Sonia Marshall-Grodisnik, and they're doing a lot of work in the immunology. And about a year ago, they identified this thing called TRPM3, transient receptor potential ion channels on natural killer cells. And this is something that they feel is very, very specifically abnormal to this illness. There are lots and lots of abnormalities in the chemistry and the immunology, but so many of them have not been proven to be absolutely specific. And if you're ever going to get a lab test or any other way of making a really reliable diagnosis, you've got to have a one or two things that stand out as being abnormal. And this team really felt that this particular abnormality and this particular mechanism, which I won't even begin to explain, is really, really important. So I think, you know, it's exciting stuff. And if anyone wants the actual reference to that work, it's there. And I'm sure that Debbie can probably send out copies of these slides and probably what Warren has produced as well for anyone who's really interested. Now, I hope we go the right way this time. Yeah, Professor Nancy Clymas, whose name will probably be someone very familiar to many of you, she's doing something quite exciting or unusual. She and her team, who are in Florida, are trying to enroll people via social media to get very large numbers to look at some of the genetics of the illness. And again, I won't go into the science of it, but they are very excited that this is a way they can get some really big numbers. And I mean, they're talking hundreds of thousands, not just, as so often studies are done on maybe 10 or 20 people. That's not to say the smaller studies are not hugely valuable, and I think some of what Warren is doing on smaller numbers is really exciting stuff. But some of these bigger studies are probably going to show up some abnormalities in people with this illness quite outstandingly. This man, Starmon Carding, he's based at Norwich in the UK and looking a lot at the microbiome. They are finding that not just bacteria reside in the gut. You know, we've always thought that it was a mainly bacterial environment, lots and lots of bacteria which are growing and multiplying in the trillions, but they've now identified quite a number of viruses also in the microbiome, and some of these viruses actually live off the bacteria like parasites. And what they're finding in the illness, this illness, is that the balance of the bacteria is probably way out of kilter in people with ME. Now, I find that particularly interesting because probably 20 years ago, I went to a conference up in Newcastle, New South Wales, and the team there were saying exactly this, that the bacterial balance was all out of kilter, and they were actually treating patients for these abnormalities with antibiotics with some success. And this was a team led by Neil McGregor and Henry Butt. They were a very intense scientific team, and they've carried on with this work in the background over the years ever since. But finally, their work is actually being recognised. It's taken all these years. I wouldn't say it wasn't recognised before, but people didn't take it as seriously as perhaps they are now. And when I went to the Florida conference last November, Neil McGregor was there presenting some of this work and having some very valid chemical explanations as to why it was happening. Anyway, coming down the road a little bit towards treatments, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the drug rituximab in a minute. That is being used to try and alleviate some of the changes that are occurring in this illness. But there's also talk about fecal transplants, and people go a bit yucky when they think about fecal transplants. You know, they imagine having someone's poo poked into their bum, and I mean, it's not like that at all, actually. It's all done under very, very sterile conditions, laboratory conditions, and there has been the beginnings of some success in trying to rebalance the abnormal bacteria, which may be causing some of the problems with some of the symptoms and problems people have with this illness. So that may well come much more into the mainstream. That he also said that probiotics are not particularly useful, even though a lot of people do take them. They may be not quite the right way of trying to rebalance the bacterial imbalances. That's not to say that probiotics are not sometimes important. I think particularly I find people use them if they've been on a lot of antibiotics and that's upset their whole gut, and they may be left with gut symptoms like diarrhea or what have you after antibiotics, but that's a different scenario really. Professor Matey Hornig, a woman from New York who's very up on this whole illness. She's been very involved for quite a long time, and I'm not going to go through all these things in detail because we'll run out of time if I do, but she does, if you look at the bottom 2 or 3 lines, she does link the genetic background or gene changes that are going on in this illness with changes in the microbiota. They involve also what we call the metabolome, which Warren will talk to you a little bit about, but that's the underlying chemistry of the body, which has, of course, effects on the brain and the central nervous system and the immune system. And this whole thing is going on, it seems, and a lot of the work that Matey has done has linked these things up. And one in particular, I think, is the issue of the microbiota affecting the way the brain develops in babies. And she's very hot on that if a baby is born normally, that baby will gather bacteria from the mother's vagina during the birth process in the mouth and face and what have you. And those bacteria that the baby gathers during birth will set the scene for the microbiome for that child's ongoing life. And if a baby is born by cesarean, they do not get those bacteria, which are so important to maintain good balance within the gut, but also effects on the development of the central nervous system and immunological stuff and what have you. And so there's now work going on looking at if babies benefit from being given the mother's bacteria, if they've been born by cesarean, given a sample of the mother's bacteria into the mouth and passages after birth. So these sorts of things are becoming to be seen as quite important, and so that's some of the work she does. You also find that some of the viruses that they're linking with all this may cross the so-called BBB, which is the blood-brain barrier, get into the brain and be one of the reasons that growing young people get, or particularly with this illness, get what we call POTS, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, whereby if you get up suddenly you feel all woozy and faint and you tend to have a very low blood pressure, and that's all controlled by the so-called parasympathetic nervous system via the brain. And I'm not going to talk about Professor Warren Tait because he's going to talk about himself. But he was a very much acclaimed speaker at the conference, and he's very respected internationally. I can't say that enough. And I will talk, and he might too as well, about B cells, because they have become quite topical. They're not actually bright blue like that. That's obviously been coloured up. But B cells are a type of white cell, and they are thought to be possibly very relevant in this illness. I won't talk much about them, but I won't talk about the background of what they actually are, but they're white cells that help us fight infection. But in certain disorders, the B cells become very overactive or too many of them, and one in particular is rheumatoid arthritis, some of the autoimmune conditions. And this woman, Jo Cambridge, uses this drug rituximab to treat some patients with rheumatoid arthritis, particularly if there's an autoimmune component to it, which almost always there is. And she has found there are two types of patients, those that respond well and those that don't, and that's all for further research. People worry that if you use rituximab, which actually decreases the B cells, destroys them. If you destroy your B cells, are you left without proper resistance against infection? But what she's found in her work is that even if the B cells are destroyed by rituximab, we still retain some what we call memory B cells, or very immature young ones, and they can regenerate and set your fighting component of your immune system. Now, I'm only giving you that as a little bit of background because I know that rheumatoid arthritis is not the illness we're talking about, but we have to say maybe this illness is an autoimmune condition because people who've been in the Norwegian trial, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, with the drug rituximab, these are CFS patients, have seemingly improved enormously when their B cells have been destroyed. So we're thinking, yes, this may be an autoimmune condition, not exactly like rheumatoid arthritis, but in that family of autoimmune illnesses. So what are these Norwegian studies? Warren's going to give you some of their scientific explanation, but I'm going to give you more the clinical stuff, and a lot of you will have already read about it, but these are cancer specialists, Miller and Flug, from Bergen in Norway, and they found probably 5 years ago now, maybe more, but anyway, a few years ago, that some of their cancer patients who are suffering from lymphoma, which is a blood cancer, some of these patients had had chronic fatigue syndrome well before their cancer. And they, 3 women, they all improved enormously when they were given the drug rituximab to destroy their B cells in lymphoma. Lymphoma is a condition where you produce far too many B cells. So they were given the drug to destroy their B cells, but incidentally it was found their ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, improved. And so studies have now been ongoing. They've studied for at least 3 years, if not more. 3 years very formally, but before that they were doing some trials to, sort of see what was happening. And they became very involved with the Norwegian ME Association, and as a result recruited patients. And the earlier trials were not done in a sort of blinded way. In other words, the patients knew what they were having, so there's always a little bit of placebo expectancy at improvement, and it's very hard to judge how accurate that improvement is. But they have since now gone on to a much more intensive trial, and the patients being trialed now, right now, are being compared with patients who are not on the drug, but nobody knows who's on it or who isn't, and they're also being, it's all blinded so that even the doctors administering it don't know who's having the drug and who isn't, and so on and so on. In other words, it's a very accurately set up trial, and people have got very excited because in May, when we were in London, they said, oh, they'd release the results in October, which is now gone. They're now saying they'll release the results in December, which is not very far off. And it'll be quite exciting to see whether this drug rituximab is actually useful or not in ME. And if it is, of course, it will hit the headlines very fast. And they've also looked at another drug called cyclophosphamide, which is a chemotherapy drug used in breast cancer. Again, similar work being done. They're also unblinding that study in December. They found when they treated patients just out of the blue with these drugs, ME patients, as the B cells were destroyed, the patient's symptoms improved, but of course then you stop the drug and their B cells start to normalize again, and symptoms did come back or relapse. So again, we don't know how long people might need to be treated with these drugs, or what the long-term risks might be and so on. They actually were treating a number of very severely afflicted patients with the cyclophosphamide, but they had to stop the study for two reasons. First of all, the patients were too sick to come in for all the assessments that are needed, but also they did have a lot of unpleasant side effects that they couldn't really tolerate. So there's a lot of interest and excitement there. They've got to consider all these things before that either drug could be released. And so again, the dose, the quality of life, is it better or not? Is the patient going to relapse? Are there side effects? Are there longer term risks? And so on and so on. And of course the cost. At the moment, these drugs, well, the rituximab's very expensive, the cyclophosphamide's a lot cheaper, but the cyclophosphamide has nasty side effects. So, you can't always win. And I won't talk anymore. I'm not going to talk much more except to just say, if you want to get a hold of the physician's primer, which has been sent out to every doctor in New Zealand, what, about 3 or 4 years ago now, Heather? 2 years ago? Anyway, whenever it's been sent out, but there will be a lot of doctors and younger doctors who haven't had it. Warren talks to medical students and gives it to them, and I'm talking about the hard copy booklet, which is about 25 pages, but people can now download it for free. So, if anyone wants to, they can, and it's quite an intensive booklet about diagnosing and managing the illness. And there's now a pediatric primer as well. I worked on with a number of other people, including Catherine Rowe, who was one of the speakers who came here a couple of years ago. She's a paediatrician in Melbourne, and various other paediatricians from around the globe. And so that's now available for doctors who have need to get information to treat children with the illness. Oh, and my own book, which was produced in May this year. That's the third and final one. Don't know that I could face writing another, but it's available there if anyone wants it. And that's my talk, and Warren will take over, and I think we'll have questions at the end, don't you?